Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm going to be starting off with Menominee Park and then move on to Millers Park. Millers Bay, and Millers Bay made a perfect environment to blah, blah, blah. No, to get our homes. You know, it's a perfect environment for mid-century homes. We have a natural environment and the mid-century. The importance of having the inside coming out, outside coming into your home was a perfect environment. Millers Bay was a perfect environment for these homes. So I'm going to start with some slides.
Spacebar will work too on the computer.
Yeah.
Maybe sure.
I could stand any place. It's your fault.
That's where we're at. Just hit that spacebar for each slide. Does that work?
Going the wrong direction. Okay, how do I go back?
Backspace.
Backspace, where's backspace? I know backspace.
Use the arrows on the bottom right of the computer. These arrows.
Okay, Lucas Miller, he came from Greece, and he was orphaned at the age of 4. He was adopted by an American colonel. His father died in the Greek Revolution, and he was adopted. His mother died right after his father died, and his father had been a powerful man in the Revolution, and he was brought to Montpelier, Vermont by his adopted father. He studied law in Montpelier, and then he came to Oshkosh eventually, where he bought 500 acres of property in the settlement of this area, and he practiced law, and he was influential in businesses and making land claims for agriculture. So he comes into town, and he's a very prominent man and a very powerful man, and he's also one that's very interested in the well-being of the community and improving the lives of people. So he comes in, and in 1854, purchases the settlement along the shoreline of Lake Winnebago, which is now Menominee Park, and he builds an Italianate mansion there, and that was the first settlement. And he thought always his land was ideal for a city park, and no one believed him and thought he wasn't getting any interest from the city to buy the land. At that point, people were going to cemeteries for parks, and often parks were donated by people, the land. And this, people weren't interested in this park because this was so swampy around here. It was all wooded, it was marshy, and no one wanted his land. But he kept trying for the city to buy his land over and over again. And no one did until, well, let's show his house, Chuck. A beautiful mansion that was at the end of Merritt. This is Lucas's home he built, and it stayed original until, it stayed original for quite a while until it turned into the concession stand. But we'll get into that later. All right, here we go. So the guy who becomes the park mayor is E.E. Stevens. And he's like, we need to get this land. And the city's like, oh no, we don't want this land. But E.E. Stevens pushed it through into the administration and said, we're going to get it. And people were so opposed to it, he paid the first payment of the $25,000 himself, and then he left office. Okay, and then, wait. Okay, so, Pratt comes in next. Pratt's the following mayor, and he also is a supporter of the park system, but because he did make that first initial payment, he was the one elected, because he wasn't involved in the purchase. He brings in Professor Green from Troy, New York, which William Waters also went to Troy, New York, to the Institute, and Pratt hires him, and he comes to the city, and he designs this amazing park. He said, this is going to be the prettiest park in the United States. He plans the 2 lagoons. He brings it, they start filling the land. This is a time period in history. There's a depression, so we were able to employ many men to come in. They cut wheelbarrows out of barrels, and they started filling the land. 3 to 4 feet of fill went into the park. So, okay, thanks. Okay. So they're working on this park the whole time, and we've got a new parks director. We named the parks director and the board, and a guy by the name of Burkhart lives in the Miller home for the first 30 years. So we've got our park stationed at Miller's home in the original look of the home, and there's a surrounding grass right around the home, and the rest of it all needs to be filled in. So during this period of 30 years, we're working on this park. And then Oaks comes into office. Oaks is now in office, and Oaks is from Winneconne. He moves to Milwaukee to Oshkosh and then to Washington, D.C., and becomes a torpedo inspector in World War I. So he's ahead of going on and supporting the parks in Oshkosh. He's big in the recreation. He brings the recreation to the center of Menominee Park. He's interested in building on more and more into this park. And that's where we get involved with Miller's Bay, because he's interested in adding land to Lake Street, which is now Menominee Street. He wants to add fill to that part of the land. So he comes into office. He's in office twice, 2 years the first term, and then 8 years on the second. And he works on improving the park. At that time, a breakwater. He wants to build the breakwaters along Menominee Park. And that is a tough thing to do. Our first breakwater was built incorrectly. People said it was the wrong direction. Slime was building up, sanitation. There was a problem with Miller's Bay. So we hired a guy from, Cheney comes in. He's hired by Truman. He's the chief engineer of building harbors. After World War II, he helped restore harbors in Greece. So he's hired by the city of Oshkosh, and he comes in and he designs our Miller's Bay Park. And this is what it would look like, what it does look like when he comes in and designs it. And not only was our first breakwater in the wrong direction, it also didn't have any culverts in it, so all the water was stagnant, and we had a big problem in Miller's Bay. So they tear down the first breakwater, they start a new one, and they put the culverts in. Okay, so Mayor Oaks, so Stewart comes, so after Oaks, Stewart comes in office. He's the next mayor to come in office. He also really believes in parks, and so he ends up building the ball diamonds, the harbor, and so he's the next man in office. And then I mentioned, this is interesting, in the mid-50s, a cruiser dock for 2 years was built in Miller's Bay, and they had these beautiful boats. Actually, this is wrong. There's 22 slips, and boats need to be 42 feet long in length or longer. And we advertised to Milwaukee and to Chicago that we have this amazing dock in Oshkosh, and they called it the Naples of Wisconsin. And then the park thought it was too exclusive, and they pulled it out. Okay, so then the dock is removed. And then Miller's, we're going to go to Miller's house. That was demolished in 79 by firemen, although in 1975, it made the historical list of homes, and then it was burned down 4 years later. So then Oaks, we're honoring it, we're continuing on with Oaks, and we have now, in 88, we have honored him as being the man that really got Miller's Bay, to be where it was today. And it created this great recreation. And Ames, we were also honored with the rock at the end of Miller's Point, and he's the man that said we need to be able to walk all the way down to the breakwater. So they created the breakwater for recreation, and Richard Ames was the man that did that, and then we've honored with the rock down there. So all these men, Oakes and Ames and Lucas Miller, they're all really instrumental. Our engineers were incredible that built our parks. And so we've got a great park and a great view for our mid-century homes.
Thank you. Yes, this was part of Wendy's talk here, but this shows the end of the park. You can see the lagoons that were put in the slips that were removed that aren't there anymore. Now there's a dock, but this again is the cruiser, that cabin cruiser I saw myself with my own eyes. And it may still exist. That's a 42-foot or 41-footer. Yeah. This is Oaks Trail.
Oaks is on the right.
Yeah, Mr. Oaks is on the right, and Mr. Carl Steiger is in the middle. Carl Steiger has a park named after him. And of course, one of our famous city councilors was Ken Schiefelbein on the left. I don't know where Ken is, but that's in City Hall. And George Oaks did a lot that I'll go into a little bit. There's, of course, Richard Ames Point. He petitioned the city to extend a walkway over the culvert or over the open water so that we could go out to Ames Point. Bill Free, who is our former city manager here, is here, Bill. And Bill said that in the newspaper article I read that Mr. Ames was the first person who fought City Hall and won by getting them to put that that extension on it so you could walk out to the end of the breakwater, which is now called Ames Point. Here is the overview shot of the park looking in a northerly direction. Of course, Miller's, you can see the two lagoons and then the Miller's Bay to the beyond. And on the right-hand side is the breakwater city water treatment basin that is on the right-hand side. This is Lakeview Park. Now, Lakeview Park, I've got to look at my little note, but Lakeview Park was land that was originally owned by Lucas Miller, and it was sold to, he sold part of it to the Pleasant Home Land Company, and then the Pleasant Home Land Company didn't do a lot with it, and they eventually sold it to the Globe. Is it on my next slide? Good. Globe Realty Sales Company. There we go. And of Sheboygan, the Globe Company of Sheboygan. The president was a Mr. Ray, and they developed several subdivisions. One of them is Raymore, named after Ray, and the other, just go back a second, but this was platted by them in 1924. This map was approved by the city of Oshkosh and accepted in 1924, and at the time, the roads basically border the same boundaries of the Millers Bay neighborhood, except for the Washington Triangle, which is now part of our Millers Bay Neighborhood Association. But the road that we know as Menominee Drive is shown here as Lake Boulevard. And what's interesting about it is Lake Boulevard is right on the shoreline. This is Lake Boulevard, and here's the lake right up to that. There's no grass area between Lake Boulevard and the shore that we now have as Menominee Park. George Oakes said we can fill further out, that the original shoreline was further to the east. This plat map actually shows the shoreline way out here, the original shoreline. This was all marshy land and not real attractive for home building. So as a result, this 1924 plat did not result in a lot of home sales because the land across the street the water across the street was a swamp, marsh, not considered attractive. Mayor Oakes, first in the 1930s, did have unemployed men who, during the Depression, build the stone shoreline that we now have. And then subsequent to that, they dredged the bay and put the dredge material to the west of the shoreline we have right now. And then they also built the breakwaters in order to protect the new shoreline because the lake would wash it away. Again, the first home on Lake Boulevard was built in 1924, and here it is. And it is basically an intact house. It does have, I believe, aluminum or vinyl siding on it, but it does look pretty darn good. It doesn't have any additions on it. The 40s and 50s, again, the lakeshore was developed. The Globe Realty Company started to sell more lots, and several things happened. Harold Damo purchased about 50 acres south of Murdoch Avenue. That was on this map as big, big sections of open land. He then, in 1954, did the first addition to Lakeview Park, and he sold this site that we're on right here, this area for the Emmeline Cook School. This school was built in 1955. Some people who are in this room may have been able to go here. And my sister, who was in the video that we were running earlier, was the first kindergarten class. I was the third kindergarten class. And the building here, again, was built in 1955. They do say the architectural design makes provision for well-lighted, well-ventilated classrooms and an environment of pleasant features that appeal to children and facilitate the teaching and learning process. Use is made of natural light through large window areas and plastic sky domes. The sky domes, I think, are gone now, unfortunately, but they leak. But anyway, so anyway, Mr. Damel is on here. A lot of this I got out of the abstracts. If anybody has an abstract or knows what they are, you may have an abstract of title. This document contains all of the recorded entries at the Register of Deeds affecting the property. And there's a wealth of history. Harold Damel unfortunately got divorced, but you can read Harold's divorce judgment in this abstract. He then married Shirley Damel, and Harold and Shirley continued. They developed this land. They developed, with the first addition to the plat, Damel Street, of course named after the Damel family. They then also sold part of the land to Dr. Louis Graber. And Dr. Graber, of course, named Graber Street. And White Swan was another street. My father was an attorney, and he represented Harold Damel, Shirley Damel, Dr. Graber, and was involved in all the platting. And he claims that he named some of the streets. I'm not sure if he did, but Cliffview Drive is supposed to be because you can see the cliff view across the lake. But again, I'm getting a little off here, but we get back to Emmeline Cook School was built. Webster Stanley was built at the same time. Having these schools helped to develop these neighborhoods by providing a place for the children. But we're also in mid-century and in the baby boom generation, which the baby boomers, a lot of us are baby boomers. It was post-1946 to about 1964, and that coincides somewhat with the mid-century modern era, which we're going to learn about in a few minutes, which is, I believe, about 1946 to 75 or something like that. But the George Washington statue was also moved to the Washington Triangle. The George Washington statue was placed in Menominee Park in 1911, at the same year that the Chief Oshkosh statue was placed in Menominee Park. Menominee Park at that time was known as North Park. When Mr. Miller sold the land to the city of Oshkosh, it was called Bonnyview Park. That's what he called it, Bonnyview. That's kind of a happy name. And, but anyway, it was when the Chief Oshkosh statue came in there, then it became, the name was changed to Menominee Park. Of course, we all know that Chief Oshkosh was the chief of the Menominee tribe that occupied this area. At the time when the George Washington statue was moved in 1957, it had previously been in Menominee Park over by the monkey cage in the zoo. It had become a question, why do they have the statue of our nation's first president next to the monkey cage? We got to get a better, more elegant place for it. And this is again about the schools. This next slide shows the school we're in right now. This room we're in is called the an activity center. It's not called a gym, so which is kind of a surprise. But I did have a chance to talk to Tom Herrenberg last week. Tom Herrenberg went to Longfellow School, and he was in the contest to name Webster Stanley. He was going to go to Webster, and Webster opened the same year and the same time that this school, Emmeline Cook, opened. And he said, I put in 4 names. And I said, what were the names? He said, Webster Stanley, Emmeline Cook, and I can't remember the other one. And so he may have not only, he's got credit for naming Webster Stanley, but he may have named this school, Emmeline Cook.
Blocking the,
Whoops. The paper's blocking, sorry. This, of course, is the George Washington statue. This statue is a full-size, life-size statue of George Washington. It was made in 1911. It's a duplicate of the original marble one in Virginia at the State House. There's also another one of these at the Palace Versailles outside of Paris, France. George is looking over at Cliff View. He's got a cliff view there. You can see the high cliff on the other side. This next picture is talking about 1950s. This person, I'm not sure who this is. It's a mystery. I'm trying to find out. But this lady is on the curve at Menominee Drive. If you look in the background, you can see what was called the Rasmussen House. It's on the right. That's a one-story, mid-century modern style house that was built in 1949. My parents' house, again, was built in 1955. That was the house with the Chevy station wagon in the driveway, and I may have shoveled that driveway. There was a lot of snow that day. But I became aware of the concept of mid-century modern in about, I believe it was 2008. The Wisconsin State Historical Society and the Oshkosh Landmarks Commission had done a historic home survey of the city. and they gave a presentation at the public library under the dome one night, and I went there. They were talking about all these historic buildings in the city, and then they said on Menominee Drive there's 2 houses National Register eligible for architecture because of their mid-century modern, and they're intact, and intact means that they haven't been changed. My parents were so busy, they had 5 kids and both worked and everything else, they never had time to remodel the building. It was intact the way it was originally built in 1955, and the State Historical Society and the Landmarks Commission feel, and I agree with them, that this gives value to the house. It also gives value to the neighborhood. And with that, I'm going to turn over the speech to our speaker here.
Nice job.
Thank you, Chuck and Wendy. Weren't they great? You can see that they really got into this, and they did a lot of work. Before we get started with our featured speaker, I'd like to introduce you to George Hosel. George Hosel lives on North Point Street, and he is the original mid-century guy in our neighborhood. George is 100 years old.
Wow.
George built his house in 1955, and he still lives there alone. And he golfs and drives his car. He had his birthday on September 21st, and we're so glad you're here, George.
Thank you.
And now I'd like to introduce to you Mr. James Shields. Mr. Shields is a design principal at HGA Architects in Milwaukee. He is an associate professor of architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He's received many awards from the Institute of Architects in Wisconsin, including one for the Discovery World Museum on the lakefront in Milwaukee, and for the DeVoe Art Museum in Northern Michigan University. He also has had a number of national awards for religious architecture, including St. Boniface Church in Mequon, St. Norbert's Chapel in De Pere, and the Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist in Milwaukee. He teaches 2 graduate level courses in the College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the UWM. And he's the author of 2 books, The Cities of James Duane Doty and Architectural Presentation. So I'd like you to welcome Mr. Shields.
Well, good morning. Thank you for turning out today. Appreciate it. When I got up this morning and saw how cold it was, I thought I might be a lonely speaker here today. But one of the things that wasn't mentioned on my bio there was my involvement in historic preservation. I actually sat on Milwaukee's Historic Preservation Commission for 17 years. And for those of you interested in service, maybe being on a commission like that, I want you to know that 17 years is too long. So when you hit a decade of service, you really have to consider moving on to something else. So I was involved, and have been involved in preservation for a long time, not only on the Preservation Commission, where I was 3 times chairman there, but also in my own practice, where I did and continue to renovate and restore a lot of historic buildings. I'm working on at least 2 of them right now. And most recently renovated or restored the bottling house on the Pabst campus in Milwaukee. So one of the largest building on the Pabst campus, and got renovated as student housing. But one of the things I want to mention is that in my time involved in historic preservation, I was often shocked to see the low regard in which mid-century buildings were held. That there was something that until very recently, wasn't worthy of historic preservation or something you could destroy or renovate willy-nilly, you know. And I think this is true of every historic movement when we're close to it. And so, for example, I just watched the low regard early in my career in which buildings from the World War I and the 1920s era were held. Something about being just a generation or two removed from a style allowed people to dismiss it. Oh, that wasn't good architecture. And that was the case with mid-century modern until fairly recently. And I wanted to give you some sense from someone who works in the architectural community. I work in both education and in professional practice, of the really steep level of respect that is occurring towards mid-century modern. And as an example, I'm turning to what has become in the last 18 years, I think, the most popular shelter magazine in America. It's Dwell magazine. And if you haven't seen it, it's something that many of you might be interested in taking a look at. And here, for example, is a front piece from, and by the way, Dwell's online, so you can also see what they do online if you have a computer at home. And here, for example, is an article called 10 Timeless Mid-Century Modern Homes. And the caption here is, "It's been more than 5 decades since its heyday, yet we still love mid-century modern." Or I think it's incorrect to say we love it again, because there was a long period of many decades in which mid-century modern was not held in high regard. But the further away we get from this, the more endearing and the great design potential of it seems to be clear all the time. For example, this is one of the lead articles from this month's Dwell, and this looks like a mid-century modern building, but it's a brand new building. And to suggest that young architects and planners are again working in an absolutely straight mid-century modern style. And actually I would say that the best young architects in Wisconsin, if I had to name who they are, it would be Johnson Schmaling Architects. They're doing house after house here in Wisconsin, and they've even busted out nationally doing houses elsewhere in the country. They're doing buildings that are almost indistinguishable from a really great 1955 building. So if you need any new buildings up here, let me tell you, I know who to call. It would be Johnson Schmaling out of Milwaukee. They could give you a mid-century building, brand new, and really make it work. And here, for example, is the exterior of another new building published in Dwell. And I could have told you this a freshly restored 1957 building, and you'd never know it. So young architects are really interested in the architecture of mid-century modern and are taking enormous inspiration from it. And not only that, but there's a new reborn interest in mid-century modern design of all sorts. So for example, here in another Dwell article, they're frequently doing articles on designers from the 1950s and 1960s. For example, this is all furniture designed by important mid-century modern furniture designer Mel Smilo. And this is all furniture designed by Mel. And boy, does that dining room look familiar to some of you? Right? You know, I'm thinking back to my mom in maybe about 1967 when I was 10. And we had a dining room an awful lot like that. We even had whatever that plant was, we had that plant. And I was warned many times not to eat it for some reason. So Mel, for example, was an important designer in his period, and all of his furniture is back now. It's all being, it's in continued production. I believe some of his children and grandchildren are involved in the company, and they're relying on his original designs. For example, that chair in the bottom there, that's a drawing by Mel. Mel could draw like a bandit, I'm telling you. Beautiful drawings that plan these pieces of furniture. And he designed everything from sofas and chairs, including lamps. It suggests that mid-century modern was more than just the architecture, that it was viewed as a sort of complete art form in which everything from carpets to furnishings and lamps and buildings could find their way. And today, and I took this is from this month's Dwell, and this is new furniture. Yes, I'm not kidding you. This is brand new furniture that's being offered. And if you can distinguish this from Mel's stuff, I'd like to know how. This is a brand new storage cabinet and brand new lamps. Let's go back to Mel's stuff, right? It's really striking. And this is happening all over the country. For example, this coat rack is from a Wisconsin firm. Wisconsin is not immune to the enormous interest in the resurgence of mid-century modern. And I would say that in America, if you're a young furniture designer or a young carpet designer or a young industrial object designer, I think they're taking more inspiration from the mid-century modern traditions than from anything else. And so, we have a enormous rebirth and interest in the design community in this architecture. And I think we're starting to also see some interest in the importance of historic preservation of the houses and other objects that remain intact from this period. And so I just wanted to take a look at the mid-century ranch house, of which you have many in the locale here, and try to understand some of its origins, of how this movement came about, and what were the influences that came together to make the mid-century ranch house. Surprisingly, I want to start talking about the Spanish colonial. I used to live out in Arizona. Right out of school, I taught at Arizona State. I taught architectural history out there and some design. And so I had an opportunity to travel the West. I hadn't been out to the West before I got that job. And one of the things I was often interested in seeing were the oldest buildings in any place that I went to. So like I would go down to Tucson, right? And I'd go to see the San Javier Mission and any of the other buildings that existed around that. So the San Javier Mission was part of Spanish colonial movement here in the New World. And throughout the West, the first Europeans to arrive and build were the Spanish. They built, for example, a whole series of missions up and down the West Coast, with I think Sonoma being the northernmost. And I visited like all of them. And they were about a horse ride apart, all up and down. So you could move from one to the other and seek shelter in mission after mission. And around these missions, they were building buildings in the Spanish traditions. And they built these, what we would call today ranches. And to describe the importance of the Spanish colonial to this, first I want to look at the word ranch, right? Because you're all living in these ranch houses. What does it mean? It's a Spanish word, and it comes from the Spanish ranchos, which surprisingly means a place where a group of people eat together. So that's the origin of the word, and then it got shortened to ranch. And initially in the New World, it became referred to a grouping of farm huts, where there'd be a farm, and you might be raising cattle, and of course you might be raising feed and other crops there. And you might have separate buildings, farmhands would live in some of them, and the whole conglomeration together was referred to as a ranch. And eventually, ranch becomes a farm in which cattle are raised. And of course, the Spanish were keen on raising cattle here in the New World. And so all of these things seem to come together in what a ranch is here, and a ranch house might be. One of the things is an aspiration to not be urban, right? To not be part of the city, which I think in the period after World War II was a really important idea here. That is, I think as soldiers came back from the war effort and married, I think there was a really strong interest in not being in the city any longer. But also, this was a period of plummeting decline in the size of a family unit. For example, in 1900, there were, like in Milwaukee, 9.8 people living in every unit of housing in Milwaukee. That was the average, almost 10 people in every unit of housing. In the 2000 census, Milwaukee had dropped to, I think, 1.72 people per unit of housing. So about 1/6 the number of people living in a unit of housing after a century. So at mid-century, this was already an important movement. That is, as people no longer wanted to live with their parents. Who can figure that? I am wonderful to my boys and constantly pestering them to do their homework. No wonder they want to get out as soon as they can. There was also a need, as the family size diminished, to move outside of the city that had already been built out in many ways. And so the escaping the city, and this was allowed also by the ability of just about everyone to own a car. So you could drive great distances and live out in the countryside and out in the suburbs. The Spanish colonial is important for another reason. You can get a sense of it here, is that the Spanish brought a tradition of these patios or courtyards that allowed for a kind of direct movement from the house to an exterior space. That's not a that's not a Western European tradition. This really comes from the Spanish. You can get a sense of it in this image. You can get a sense of a big room where people are eating, ranchos there, and in fair weather they can throw open these doors and move in and out of the house and expand the house out into this exterior space that in many urban areas is not either possible or desirable for one reason or another. So this Spanish colonial, not only the word of the ranch house, but this idea of this indoor-outdoor living. Also, almost all of the really early Spanish colonial buildings that I visited out in the West, and this is both in Arizona and all up and down the California coast, they're all one-story buildings. And I think, these were people who were building in the 1500s in the wilderness, right? And you're trying to get something up before winter arrives. And, one-story buildings really make the ticket. They're this sort of architecture of expedience. And also if you don't have a lot of timber available to you, as they frequently did in Arizona, building low one-story buildings turned out to be a really desirable and economical thing to do. And so I think that also explains the lowness of these. Also the vast amounts of land available in the western expansion of America also allowed you to build really big footprint one-story buildings rather than densely packed 2- or 3-story buildings in the Western European tradition. So these Spanish colonial settlements, they really had a lot of in them that came forward in the mid-century modern ranch house. I would also say there have been a number of Spanish colonial revivals here on this continent, and so people got to see various versions of this, not only the originals. The craftsman style that came out of the arts and crafts movement, a movement that actually came out of Great Britain but swept America early in the 20th century, and produced these arts and craftsman style houses, are another important sort of antecedent to the mid-century modern ranch house. These houses start to be more sprawling, start to be built outside of cities, in near suburbs, for example. They often have larger first-floor footprints and only partial second-floor footprints. They also start to establish like livable porches and also terraces out and back, emphasizing that indoor-outdoor living. The craft tradition is also interesting and antecedent to the mid-century modern. For example, the emphasis on how the building is made and exposing that in the architecture. That is, rafter tails, seeing the framing of buildings and how they're made. That starts to be important in the mid-century modern as well. Frank Lloyd Wright, in some ways, emerged and was heavily influenced by the arts and crafts movement, although we wouldn't admit it. But Frank Lloyd Wright produced a lot of ideas, I think, that are very important to mid-century modern. I'll just mention a few of them here. One of them is the sort of anti-urban sentiment. Much of Wright's work was, he lived and worked in Chicago, but he started living and working in distant suburbs like Oak Park that were railway suburbs, where lots were much larger. There was a leafy sense of greenery there, and one could again explore buildings that had a sprawling horizontal sensibility. And he really talked a great deal about developing terraces and courtyards such that the building could expand outward, out into the landscape, and allow rooms to flow out. You get some sense of that, of low-walled terrace, for example, that rooms could spill out into here. Also, one of the important parts of Wright's work, you can see in this house, is masonry walls. He used brick, stone, and the articulation of these masonry walls as extremely horizontal. Here he's taking bricks and he's pushing out alternating courses of the brick. So there are protruding bricks in horizontal layers. And you'll see that throughout some of your houses here in Millers Bay. Some of them are built out of stone, some out of brick, sometimes even concrete block walls done in ways like this. There are other aspects of Wright's work that are important and really resonate with the mid-century modern. And one of them is Wright's focus on opening up the interior planning of a home. The homes that Wright got to see from, let's say, the Victorian era in Chicago and in Wisconsin had been really divided into discrete rooms. Discrete rooms that, in his view, sometimes even divided up family groups. For example, there might be a room for men to retreat to after dinner. And by the way, these houses were packed. Remember, the average household had 9.8 people living in it. And that meant that, many houses had like 15, 16 people living in a house, right? To have a 9.8 average at 1900. And then there'd be a room for women to retreat to after dinner. And then, of course, there'd be a playroom for the children. And Wright looked at this and said, boy, what kind of family are we putting together here? And especially if the word ranchos means a place where people, are coming together. And so Wright started to break down the barriers between rooms, discrete rooms for different parts of the family. And he would start to have large openings or flowing open space in between the different parts of the house. Not bedrooms, of course, but between all the living parts of the house. He even started to do houses that were for someone else beside, with kitchens, that were for someone else besides the servants. In America, I think in 1900, the census, the number 2 occupation was household servant. The number 1 was agricultural worker. I wouldn't advise those professions for you young people anymore, but they're long gone. And Wright, I think, could start to see this coming, that one day people would cook for themselves, and cooking might be a family event, and people would want to hang around together as the meal was being prepared. and they want to eat together and then do something together after the meal, right? Like, which is our modern notion of family life today. And so he started even doing kitchens that the owners of the home might use, not just a separate walled-off room for servants to prepare their food in. And so he started opening up kitchens to the dining place and opening up a dining place to living and family rooms, such that you couldn't avoid your kids anymore. There's another thing showing at the top of this screen that's important to Wright, and important, I think, to many of these Millers Bay mid-century modern ranch houses, and that for Wright was the hearth. At the center of this house, sticking up here, is a huge brick fireplace that drops down right at the center of the house. And these family spaces, he wanted them to sort of cluster or pinwheel around the hearth. And he saw this hearth as a symbolic gesture, especially in our northern climate, a place where you could have a fire. And even if we didn't heat the house that way anymore, and these houses had central heating, burning coal primarily to produce hot water, but the hearth for him was spiritually important. And I think we can see that in many of the mid-century houses here in Millers Bay. This dominant hearth figure. Even if the house was centrally heated, and you're not going to use the fireplace all the time, it was a symbolic gesture. And I think that really emerged out of Wright, and with open living spaces arranged around it. You know, Wright was fiercely competitive with another group of architects living and working at the same time who emerged in the 1920s. And these we generally call the modernist architects, who really came from Europe. And especially at the period leading up to World War II, when things went to hell in a handbasket in Germany and the rest of Western Europe, we saw a lot of Europe's best architects flee the Nazi regime and seek refuge here in America. And one of them was a great German architect, Mies, M-I-E-S, Mies van der Rohe. And he came here to the Midwest, and he set up shop down in Chicago, and he was hired as the director of the Illinois Institute of Technology and their architecture program. And he had been influential from Europe before the war, but his arrival in America was a big deal. And many young architects followed his work here in America. Not only his teaching, which was broadly influential, but his architecture here, like the Farnsworth House down in Plano, Illinois, down in a floodplain, by the way, which you can see photos of this house that's completely surrounded by water. Thank God it's up on stilts, you know. And you can get a sense of the strict and almost harsh modernity of his architectural thinking. This is an all-steel house, right, which is a rare thing. That is, generally houses here in this continent, they were made out of wood frame, right? It's a house out of nothing but steel and glass. But this one too had the, you can just look through the windows and see it, the lack of enclosed rooms that Wright had started to move towards. And they started to call this the open plan, such that a kitchen and a dining room and a living room and a family room and even a library, they might be all in one big open flowing great room, which is today, of course, called the Great Room. No trouble figuring out where that one comes from. And you can also get a sense that he has some interest here in the house flowing out to outdoor spaces, like the living spaces being able to flow out to that terrace and down to this terrace and directly down out onto the landscape in ways that are very different than typical urban houses of previous decades. Another really important influence in the development of the mid-century ranch house was a program in California that's generally called the case study house program. And in California, which was seeing a boom economy like a few others in the post-World War II period, some of the greatest architects that were working in America at the time came together to produce these sort of experimental houses that were intended to be to serve as models for how to build in the rest of the country. And these case study houses were really broadly published, and I think many young architects really aspired to do something as interesting and cool and as forward-thinking as the case study houses. So I want to show you a couple of the case study houses, and there are a lot of them. But I want to show you some of the most influential ones, and also mention some of the architects and designers that were part of the case study program. Like house number 9, the Entenza house.